لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كلامه من يطع الرسول فقد أطاع الله وقال الله تبارك وتعالى في مكان أخرى يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم صدق الله مولانا العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الأمين الكريم وقال الله تبارك وتعالى في شان حبيبه مخبرا وآمرا إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصل عليه والصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا نبي الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا شفيع المذنبين يا صاحب الجمال ويا سيد البشر من وجهك المنير لقد نبر القمر لا يمكن الثناء كما كان حقه بعد خدا بزرگ تهی قصة مختصر وأحسن منك لم تر قط عين وأجمل منك لم تلد النساء خلقت مبرأ من كل عيب كأنك قد خلقت كما تشاء الحمد لله के बाद निहायती वाजिब एहतराम बुजुर्गों भाइयों और साथियों अस्सलामु अलैकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू I've been ordered by Mohammad Sahib to speak in English, so inshallah my main speech will be in English. But before I start, I would like to recite a couplet of Sayyidi al-Hazrat Rahimahullah, just to express that no matter how much we praise the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can never fulfill the right of the praise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sayyidi al-Hazrat Rahimahullah फरमाते हैं, तेरे वस्फ तो ऐबे तनाही से हैं बरी, तेरे वस्फ तो ऐबे तनाही से हैं बरी, हैरान मेरे शाह क्या क्या कहूँ तुझे. So inshallah, the topic that I have chosen today is about the ita'at of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's about following and obeying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why is it important for us to obey the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Day in and day out, you would hear Molana Sahib. He will always express the lifestyle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sirat al-Mubarakah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what's the reason that the ulama, they express the Sirat of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Why is it so important for us to recognize the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Inshallah ta'ala, today I will try and convey a few notes on this topic. There are two parts of two different ayat that I recited at the beginning, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us clear instructions about obeying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The first ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. Now over here, this is the point that I like to make many times whenever I recite an ayat that begins with Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. Why is this kind of speech, why is this style of speech so important to us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran has expressed many ways in which He speaks to the people directly. For example, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اعْبُدُوا رَبَّكُمُ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it comes to Himself, when it comes to worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it comes to knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to the entire humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not differentiate in his khitab. He says, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, O mankind, O humans. Ya ayyuhan nas, u'budu rabbakum alladhi khalaqakum. Worship your Lord, the one who created you and the one who created those who came before you. But when it comes to specific acts of worship, so there's two things here. One is worship as a whole concept. When we're talking about worship as a whole concept, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the entire humankind. When it comes to specific acts of worship which bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala excludes the non-believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's khitab is direct to the believers. For example, in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes fasting necessary upon us, this is a form of worship. A form of worship that's only given to the Muslims, the believers. He says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kutiba alaykum as-siyam kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum. So he specifically speaks to who? The believers. He speaks to me and you. The khitab is for me and you. And everyone who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here, this gives the ayat more grandeur. Every single ayat of the Quran is extraordinary. But whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He specifies something, that thing, it becomes greater in status. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing here? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing direct khitab. To who? The Muslims, me and you. He's directly explaining to us a way of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Says, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul. In the other ayah, ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul means obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obey the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In the second ayah that I recited, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He clears certain doubts in our heads before they could even come into our heads. This is how merciful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clears doubts before they could form in our minds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, مَنْ يُطِعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ عَطَاهُ. In the first ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and obey the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Doubts will start coming into our heads. What are those doubts? What's the difference between the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Is the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the obedience of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam two different things? This is tafsir al-Quran bil Quran. This is where Quran itself clarifies itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَنْ يُطِعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهِ. The one who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expresses His love for His beloved. The concept of Mawlid, like Molana was saying earlier, the concept of Mawlid is very simple. The whole concept of Mawlid, of why it was started, was to express our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as time passed, the scholars, the Salafus Salihin, the pious predecessors, they used to gather everyone they could and they would talk about the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is Mawlid. Talking about the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Mawlid. thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for sending His beloved, this is Mawlid. I'm sorry to say, but sometimes we celebrate in a manner which is not befitting of the word Mawlid. Sometimes we've seen it where people, they start to celebrate in a way which Islam prohibits itself. So Mawlid has never been wrong. Mawlid, the celebrations of Mawlid have never been wrong. The way we celebrate it, that is the question. How did our pious predecessors celebrate Mawlid? They celebrated Mawlid by talking about the seerat of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They celebrated Mawlid by talking about how we can gain closeness to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How we can become closer to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and as a result of following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, becoming closer to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how we can get closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So coming back to the topic, من يطيع الرسول فقد أطاع الله. Now there are a few points of why we need to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Few questions. When the first few ayat of the Quran were revealed upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do the belief of these ayat? How did we come to know that this is Quran? How do we know that what we read is the Quran? We know this because it is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are two things. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the ayat, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the cave and said, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." And he recited the first 5 ayat of that surah. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam preached this, how did we, or how did the people, or how did the Sahaba know that this is Quran? This sentence, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," and he recited the 5 ayat, and then he said, "This is the direct speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." This sentence, just this sentence of "this is direct speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala," is this Quran or is this hadith? Answer. Is this Quran or is this hadith? This is hadith. So how did we get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech? How do we recognize Kalamullah? How do we recognize the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We recognize it through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which shows us that if we do not follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not bestowed His greatest favor by giving us the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we would never have reached Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the people today who want to bypass the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and go directly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they cannot prove that the Quran is Kalamullah from the Quran itself. The Quran itself explains it many times, expresses it many times, that this is directly from Allah. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. It says it in the Quran, but how do we know that this is correct? Who do we trust? Who do we go to? We go to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's how the Sahaba lived their lives. The Sahaba, they lived their entire lives obeying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, some people, they ask this question when we praise the Sahaba, when we hold mahafil at different times for specific Sahaba, explaining their contributions to Islam, explaining why they are so great. The question that is posed is, why do you talk about the Sahaba so much? What made the Sahaba so great? The simple answer is, what made them great was the obedience of the Prophet ﷺ. No man in history, no person in the Islamic history has gained a status without the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba, they followed the Prophet ﷺ so carefully that there's a hadith about Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala. He radiallahu ta'ala was once making wudu. He was performing wudu. And he radiallahu ta'ala finished his wudu. He looked towards the skies and he smiled. The people around him, they started asking. They said that we've never seen you do this before. What's the benefit behind this? Why do you do this? Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala did not give logical answers to why he looked up to the sky and smiled. Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala did not provide the details for why he looked at the sky and smiled. Sayyidina Usman radiallahu ta'ala only gave one answer. He said, I did this because I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do this once. This was the love of the Sahaba for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is how the Sahaba, they followed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the core. That is the reason why, after centuries have passed, we still talk about the Sahaba. We still talk about the Sufiya. We still talk about the awliya. Why? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions a rule as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah, He first says to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The reason for following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam will lead you directly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number two, in the first ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ, if any of you have a dispute, you have an argument, then return it back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? If at any point in our lives, if we are stuck, if we do not know what decision to make, the Quran is telling us what to do. The Quran says, go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. No matter how far you've come out, no matter what kind of difficulty you're in, no matter what kind of difficulty you've been placed in, what kind of argument you're having, all you have to do is refer back to the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. That indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed the best of examples in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam amongst us. This is the reason why we need to refer back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Our day-to-day life, we become so busy that it becomes impossible for us to follow the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is our downfall. This is why there's a decline in the Muslim Ummah. Look at the books of history. The Muslims conquered till Spain. The Muslims conquered till Persia. The Muslims won every single battle they fought. Some lands they won without battles. Why? Because they had the love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in their hearts. Not only love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We claim love from our tongues. The Sahaba, they did not just have love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They had true love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when you love someone truly, you try to follow that person to his core. Every single step that that person has taken, you try to follow in their footsteps. This is why following the Prophet ﷺ is so important for us in this day and age. Whenever something happens in the Western world, we go into a frenzy, we go into a panic. Why? Because we don't have an example to follow. We don't know how to respond. We don't know what Islam is teaching us. You cannot attain the teachings of Islam going away from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You will only find Islam if you go towards the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said this. Another example. Another question. We all know Surah Ikhlas, right? We all recite, people like us, we recite Surah Ikhlas in every level. So we know Surah Ikhlas very well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ikhlas, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. O my beloved, say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. اے میرے پیارے محبوب آپ فرما دیجئے کہ اللہ ایک ہے. Now the question is, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said Allahu Ahad, would this be enough? Of course not. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself said Allahu Ahad, remove the word qul. The word qul, it means you say. In Arabic, sigha amr. It's used to command or request something. You say, O beloved, Allahu Ahad, Allah is one. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said Allahu Ahad, would we have gotten the same meaning out of the ayat? Yes or no? Of course we did. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say Qul huwallahu ahad? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala go through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Even in the ayat that express the tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, do not ever deviate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because the day you deviate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is the day when you go away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not speak to us, beloved us. Now another question. Was it within Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power to express the Quran to every single one of us? Yes or no? Of course it is. This is within His power, this is within His qudrat. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could convey this message to every single human being himself. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala go through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Two answers. Number one, it is not the status of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to talk to people like me. We are not pure enough to have kalam with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are not pure enough to bear the weight of the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is one reason. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran on top of the mountain would crumble. But it was the heart of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that could accept this Quran. That's the first point. The second point, this was to show the status of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was to show that if you try to come towards me without the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the only thing you will see is failure and disaster and deviation. You can never find the truth without going through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are the things that we need to think about nowadays. In our lives today, we've become so busy that we do not give time to Islam. We've become so busy that we do not ponder upon why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent us on the face of this earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, مَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. The ultimate goal for every single person sitting in this masjid today is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That pleasure can never be attained without following the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we cannot follow a manuscript that we have never read. We can never follow an instruction manual that we've never read. We can only follow something if we know that thing. So if we do not know anything about the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how do we expect ourselves and then our children to follow the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, and this hadith, this should be a wake-up call for us. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that on the day of judgment, a person will be brought forward, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will order the angels to place this person into the hellfire. Why? Because of his deeds. This person, he went against Islam his entire life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish him. He will say to the angels, he will order the angels, or angels, throw this person into the hellfire. And that person, he will turn around and say, Ya Allah, I have one request. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, what is it? This person, he will reply, the reason why I didn't follow your deen is because my father didn't teach me your deen. Do not put me in the hellfire on my own. Take my father with me, please. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will order the angels. And the father was ordered to go to Jannah. He was on his way to Jannah. And the angel will drag the father and throw him into the hellfire as well. Why? Because it is our duty to teach our kids about Islam. It is our duty to teach the kids about the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we do not know the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we cannot convey it to the next generation. If there is one thing and only one thing that you take away from this gathering, I would like you to take away the point that you can never attain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can never attain salvation without the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you can never know the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam without studying about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this Mawlid, make an intention, half an hour a day, 20 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day. You will spend on studying the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is the best favor you can do upon yourself and your children. The generations to come will thank you the same way we thank the first person who became Muslim in our generation, in our lineage. Can you imagine? Imagine the first person. Imagine we didn't become Muslim. Where would we be today? So thanks to that person, thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first that person who became a Muslim. The same way, if you teach your kids about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam today, tomorrow when you are in your graves, those children will pray for you. Those children, they will ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for your forgiveness. Why? Because you showed them the straight path. And for those people who say, what do you gain by talking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? By talking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and by learning about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the only way Khalid bin Walid became Sayyidullah. Allah. The only way Khalid bin Walid became Sayyidullah the sword of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was because of his love for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The only way Sayyidina Ali al-Murtada radiallahu ta'ala anhu became the lion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was through the love and affection to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The only reason why we talk about Sayyidina Umar Farooq, Usman Ghani and Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhum ajma'in is because they love the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and they follow them to the core. The reason why Molana Sahib was talking about the great Sufiya of their times and was talking about the salvations that we gained in Jerusalem. Why was that? Why do we talk about Salahuddin al-Ayyubi even after 1,000 years? Why? Because he followed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One last point about Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, because Molana Sahib mentioned it, came into my head, that it is written in the history books that when the Crusaders they attacked the walls of Jerusalem, this was a reinforcement of the Crusaders. When they attacked the second time, they outweighed the Muslims in number. And this has happened over and over again in history, where the non-believers, they outweigh the Muslims. They outnumber the Muslims. About Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, he used to be in the front row fighting all day. And at night time, he would still wake up for tahajjud. He would never miss his fajr. If we tonight sit and praise the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam all night, do we talk about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam all night? Do we spend our wealth in the name of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam all night? But when the time of Fajr comes, we are fast asleep. Every single thing you did tonight is not accepted in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Qurratu ayni fi salah." The teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam are the things that will make us successful in this world and the hereafter. Now today, last point, and I'll finish inshallah. Today we run after things like power and wealth and women. In the times of the Sahaba, there's a study conducted in America about the wealth of Sayyidina Usman Ghani radiallahu ta'ala. They said that the wealth that Sayyidina Usman Ghani radiallahu ta'ala owned, if we convert it into today's money, he will be the richest person alive. Not only the richest person alive, but he would beat the richest person by billions of dollars. And when you look at the life of Sayyidina Usman Ghani radiallahu ta'ala, what do you see? You see that he spent his days and nights loving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He spent his days and nights working to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. Which shows us that wealth is not earned by us. Wealth is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want your rizq to increase, if you want your health to increase, if you want your family to have barakah in it, start loving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Start following the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives me the ability to act upon what has been said. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all the ability to act upon what has been said. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive anything if I have said anything wrong. وَمَا عَلَيَّ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ.